Welcome to our Urban Collaborative Collab Talk. Thank you for joining us. I am Ruchika Chopra and I work with the Urban Collaborative. I am here along with my colleagues, Executive Director of the Urban Collaborative, Lauren Katzman, and Project Manager Catherine Benedict. We will be supporting this conversation today and will keep an eye out for questions that you may have for our presenter and answer any Urban Collaborative related questions. We want our conversations to be collaborative and interactive. So please, during the presentation, in the chat, put in your questions. We will respond to them during or after the presentation. Let me remind you that we will be recording this session and will have it available for you and your colleagues to review. Also, closed captioning has been enabled. So if you need that, please turn it on for yourself. Before we start with our presentation for today, we wanted to let you know that our collab talks, these Zoom meetings, will be taking a summer break. But we will be back in late August with a lot more conversations and ways to collaborate. Stacey, can you change the slide? One of the conversations that we will have at the end of September and beginning October is a series with 2 half-day sessions for you and your teams discussing the concept of co-planning to co-serving to co-learning. These sessions will be facilitated by the group Integrated Comprehensive Systems for Equity, ICS, and will have a small fee attached to it. To let us know that you will be interested, we ask you to complete a brief interest survey that you can access by going to the link that's been posted in the chat. And we also have a QR code on this slide. So I'll just give you a minute, a couple seconds to just take the click on the link for the interest survey or access the QR code before sharing another thing that we are hoping you will access. And Stacey, if you change the slide, we can talk about that. Before the end of May, so in the next couple of weeks, we have 3 more things to share with you that will be happening. One, you'll, as usual, if you're a member of the Urban Collaborative, you will receive the Collab newsletter at the end of May. Next week, you will have access to our May Collabcast, our podcast with Dr. Stacey Schultz and her son, Lucas, who is in 5th grade, where both of them talk about the supports that Lucas needs in school and how they've had to continually maneuver the system to get these supports. Please listen out for that. Today, along with this collab talk, our next collab PD has also gone live, where Sherry Raven, Director of SEL Implementation at Castle, shares a quick introduction to SEL, gives a quick overview of the Castle framework, and then shares information about implementation on the ground, including tools to help you get started in your school or at your district. The last thing I want to share is that we will soon be reaching out to our member districts with registration information for our November meeting that is happening in New York City. Really excited about that. And we urge you all to join us there. If you're not a member and want to learn more about that or anything else that I've just shared with you, please email us at urbancollaborative@asu.edu. Now for today's presentation. We have with us Dr. Stacey Heiligenthaler, the Chief Officer of Special Education and Student Supports from Greenwich Public Schools. Today, Stacey will be addressing and sharing the specific systematic district approaches that Greenwich Public Schools has taken to reduce disproportionality in their schools that they were cited for by the Connecticut State Department of Education in 2022. Stacey has held a variety of classroom and educational positions, including being a special education teacher, inclusion specialist, program specialist, and coordinator in both urban and suburban school districts in California and Connecticut. Welcome, Stacey.
Thank you. Really excited to be here to talk about disproportionality. I know it's not as sexy of a topic as AI and, some of the social emotional learning, but I think it's really important and it's something that I'm particularly very passionate about in looking at how we can have that equity of access for our students. So a little about me. So I'm Dr. Stacey Heiligenthaler. I'm the Chief Officer of Special Ed and Supports here in Greenwich Public Schools. I've had the opportunity, as shared before, of being able to work both in urban and suburban schools, and both large districts and small districts. So I feel like I have a good sense of working at, when I was in California at Anaheim Union, which is 200,000 students, and a little bit about Greenwich is we have about 8,600 students. So very, very big and very small in comparison to that. So Greenwich Public Schools, we're in the southern part of Connecticut, almost to the New York line. Like I can see it down the road. It's that close. We are composed of 11 elementary schools. 3 of our elementary schools are Title I schools. 16 we have 16 preschool classes at 5 of our elementary sites, and we'll be opening up a 6th site and a 17th preschool class next year. We have 3 middle schools. 1 is a Title I middle school. We have 1 very large high school, an alternative high school, and 1 transition program for our 18 to 22-year-old students. We have about 8,600 students enrolled. About 1,300 are identified as students with an IEP, and we're also just shy of about 500 students as being identified as an English learner. And I wanted to kind of give those stats a little bit, so as we talk about the disproportionality, you can kind of see that Greenwich is often thought of as a very affluent district, which we are, but we're also a very diverse district. We have, like I said, we have our Title I schools, and we have on the other side of the district, you know, schools that have large parent donation populations and everything kind of in between. And so as we start to look at disproportionality and how it is on a district level, it's important to kind of keep in mind how diverse our school district is. So as I shared in 2022, at the end of the school district, I got the lovely letter from the state of Connecticut that says that the Connecticut State Department of Education has identified Greenwich as having a significant disproportionality based on race, ethnicity as a result of the district having a relative risk index of greater by 3 for more than 3 years. So I don't know how other states necessarily calculate your disproportionality from the state, but Connecticut looks at the RRI to determine, you know, are you making students eligible equitably across all of the race ethnicity groups. And they look at if you are above a 3 for more than 3 years and you're not showing a decrease. And so you can see from this that in 2019, 2020, for our intellectual Hispanic population, we were at a 4.19, a 3.48, and moved to a 4.12. So we weren't significantly decreasing. And we stayed above that for 3 years. So we got the lovely letter that said, you know, here you are. I don't know how many of you might have, and this is the hard part about being virtual. I would love to hear how many of you might be disproportionate. So put it in the chat about, you know, whether or not you were cited or whether or not you're monitoring and you know that you're close to that. Because that can happen in all different areas, and, you know, autism, ID, learning disability. Really, you're looking for anything that is outside of what that average rate is. And so even when you're monitoring it and when you get that letter from the state, that's definitely not good news. So just a little bit about the relative risk index. The state of Connecticut uses this to look at multiple factors. So not just special education identification, but also discipline. You can look at it in terms of enrollment in advanced classes. I had the opportunity several years ago in my previous district in working with Dr. Eddie Fergus. If anybody ever wants to read a great book on disproportionality, he has a book, Solving Disproportionality and Achieving Equity. That is a great book that talks about how that risk index can be looked at and how it can be used for different things, not just special education eligibility, and how are we equitably distributing our students all over. So when we got our letter from the state of Connecticut, we were found to be, I tried to highlight it in pink, 4.12. This is the relative risk index that we have for all of our subgroups. And so the one that we were out of compliance on was really the intellectual disability for students who were Hispanic and Latino. So we had to take a look at what we needed to do in order to really address that number. One of the things that also comes with being found significantly disproportionate at that level that we were is, in addition to a required review of our policies, procedures, and practices, we also were required to have a 15% mandatory set aside of our IDEA grant. So for our IDEA grant, we had to set aside 15% that we used, that was required to be used to address the disproportionality in part, or addressing other areas that might be areas that we need to look at. One of the things that, as we started to look, is I called it being in disproportionality jail, because it's a big deal when you have to tell your superintendent and your school board that 15% of your money has to be earmarked for certain things that might have been funding other things, and to say, okay, this has to be used for these steps. And so I was very conscious of making sure to say, okay, if we're addressing this, we need to take a look at all of the areas, because we don't want to be back here in another year or two. And I think that that's really, really important to think about. And, I'm like, it's not just we were disproportionate, which is not a good thing, but there was a financial penalty at that point. So it really was like, okay, what do I do? What do we do next? How are we going to address this? And the first thing that we had to do was really do a deep data dive into the students that were in that category. So we did a file review for all of our students that were eligible as intellectual disability, because we wanted to make sure, are all of these students, should they be eligible? Are they in the correct eligibility? The state of Connecticut has 3 data points that students have to meet in order to be classified as a student with intellectual disabilities. And that's that they have to have an IQ below 70, and they have to have a standard deviation and a half on adaptive skills, both at school and at home. So they must hit those 3 points in order to be ID'd. We went through all the files and all of the students that were classified as ID. And we didn't just look at the Hispanic students that we were cited for. We went through everybody's file, and everybody did meet those criteria. What's interesting about Connecticut is that our eligibility for the alternative assessment, so our students who don't take the standard assessment, they have to meet the same criteria as students who meet the ID eligibility. So in order to take our alternative assessment, you have to have an IQ below 70 and a standard deviation and a half on home and school adaptive measures. So what we looked at was, we were like, but we have about 3 times as many students who qualify for the alternative assessment than we do with students who qualify as ID. And so the question became, why is there this difference between who's eligible as ID and who is taking the CTAA? And each team determines eligibility, but we wanted to take a look at what were those other eligibilities that students were being classified as, why were they being classified as, and really taking a deep look into that. And that is where we found, that's where we found the biggest discrepancy, was that there was not consistency in how eligibilities were being determined across the district at all the schools. So what a team might be doing at one school was not what a team was doing at a different school. What their understanding of an eligibility for an ID student versus a learning disability student was not the same. So we set out with a plan of addressing the different categories and addressing different questions that the state asks, to have a very systematic plan of how do we address that at the state level. So the first question that the state asked was, how does the district ensure that its policies and procedures related to the identification of students with disabilities are adhered to in practice? And these are all the different things that we did. We made sure that our special education coordinators reviewed IEPs with school staff. We made sure we used our eligibility checklists. We had initial eligibility teams to help make that initial identification so that there was consistency. We did professional development in the identification checklist that were was provided to psychologists and speech and language pathologists, professional development on administration of test protocols, professional development provided to building administrators on procedures and practices, quality IEP training, special education supervisor assigned specifically to making sure that these are all the practices that we were doing. So we really took a look at all of these things. But I think there's 3 in there, and I highlighted them, that I think made the biggest difference to this question, right? Because you list all these things that you're going to do, but often it's a couple key things that you look at the end and go, wow, those are really what the impact was. And it really was looking at the consistency of determining eligibility using the eligibility checklist. In the state of Connecticut, we have eligibility checklists for almost all of our disability categories. We don't have one for OHI, but there are still guidelines around who would qualify. And it was making sure that all of our teams use the eligibility checklist when determining eligibility, both at the initial stage and at the students' 3-year reviews. It couldn't be, I just think that you're ID, or I think that you're LD, or I think that you're OHI. It really is taking a look and saying, okay, what are all the categories that you possibly could be? Then considering that, do you meet the criteria? And then determining what is the most appropriate eligibility. Connecticut's a state of a single primary eligibility. So there's no secondary or tertiary. So we get one. So, often we know that students have comorbid disabilities and could qualify under 2 or 3. We need to just choose one. But what we have to make sure is that we discuss all of the eligibilities that students could possibly be qualified for. That it can't be a team just going in and saying, this is the one we pick. It's really making sure that everybody looks at all of that. And I'm going to try clicking and just showing you. I thumbs up from somebody if you can see that it moved to a different page. Thank you. So this is from our State Department of Education, and you can see that there are guidelines and worksheets for the different areas for the disabilities. And so we spent time going over these eligibility worksheets, specifically with our school psychologists and our speech and language pathologists, because there's actually guidelines for eligibility for speech and language, both as a primary disability, but also as a related service. So making sure teams understood what the purpose was and how to have that conversation. Because it's not just reading the boxes and like checking it off. It is a guided discussion and how to document that. We also did the same training with our building administrators. And going back to saying here, I'll go back and then show, let's see, I can show one. And actually taking a look at explaining what that is on the documentation. So this is an example of the eligibility documentation for a student for an intellectual disability. So it goes over intellectual functioning, adaptive behavior at home, and adaptive behavior at school. And then it talks about instruction, but again, it helps guide the team in making sure that there's equity in the decision making when you're looking at the disabilities. We had worksheets, like I said, for everything, and even for our students with a learning disability, which has become Connecticut also has a dyslexia category for eligibility. So going through the learning disability checklist and then the team determining the next step for dyslexia. What's important is making sure that everybody has that same understanding of what the disabilities are and using the checklist consistently. I think that's my biggest message out of this was it was not every team was using the checklist. And so if you were in one part of town, maybe that particular team was very comfortable using the LD checklist. And so even if you might have had met the criteria for a different disability, that's the one they felt most comfortable with. So it was really helping them understand and feel comfortable. The next question that the state asked was to, how do we ensure that district evaluations are sufficiently comprehensive? And so again, we had lots of different things that we put in place, eligibility teams, if we had to grant an IEE, which we have a lot of in Greenwich, going over with the teams and explaining what was missing from the evaluation is why we granted it. Making sure and training with our teams on how to develop a testing plan for students. Again, a lot of time spent around just professional development. But one of the big things, again, I highlighted, I think, which I think were the key things, was really looking at that professional development about what is a comprehensive evaluation. But then also we spent time making a comprehensive guide to assist our team in knowing what tests could be used. So we created a district document, this is Google document, Google at its best, right? In which we had each of the categories. So like this is a student, if you're looking at a category for a student with autism, that these are the cognitive measures, academic measures, speech and language measures that a team could go in and take a look at. These are the different tests that would be appropriate to be testing a student if you're looking at the eligibility of autism. And
Stacey,
we did
can you
that.
make that a little larger?
Sure. There. Does that work better? Good. So so you can see we put what the ages were. So the different tests, the academic, adaptive measure, social skills, autism specific. We also have a section in there that if you have students who are bilingual and culturally and linguistically diverse, so that we could look at that, so that teams, if they were considering it, had access to all of the different evaluations that were possible. So that's an example of autism. If we were looking at SLD, here again is the cognitive measures, the academic measures, speech and language, are bilingual and culturally linguistically diverse. So we did this for all of the different categories to help our teams know what was available. Because often I know that you can use a Wyatt, but if I don't know that there's other measures out there, then I wouldn't choose those. And so a Wyatt is great, especially if you're looking at SLD dyslexia, because it gives you that dyslexia index. But if I've always used the Woodcock-Johnson, I might not know that the Wyatt has that. So we really wanted to provide our staff the support of saying, these are the tests that are the best tests, and choose based on your own experience, based on what the student needs, to be able to make that comprehensive. And then we also created for our teams to help them know where tests were. So for example, our academic assessments, I'll make that bigger because I know it'll be small. So we listed out like what every building has. Then we had clusters. So these are our most common tests that everybody has. Our clusters that maybe you don't use as much as, but we want, and a cluster is four schools. It's 3 elementaries with 1 middle. And then at the high school, which is divided into houses, each of the 5 houses has one. And so that way people know where the tests are. And then we also have our district assessments. So for example, Key Math, the B edition, everybody has the Key Math A edition, but we only need to give Form B, maybe to 2 kids a year. So that might be something that we keep up here at central office. So we kept, again, that kind of information for our academic, for our speech and language, for our psychological assessments, so that our staff knew what tests to give, where were the tests. We spent a ton of money, good money. It was money well spent on making sure everybody had those tests, because I never want to be in a position and I tell my staff we didn't give that because we just didn't have it, right? If that's the test we need, then that's the test we need. So that was where some of our ARP money came in very, very handy, is in making sure that we were able to update all of that. Another tool that we use to help in training our staff is Connecticut actually put together the Connecticut Assessment Resource Guide for specific learning disabilities in reading and writing. And this was another really great tool in that listing assessments. But when you go in, let's see. What it breaks it down to is skill related, so that staff would then know what areas to test in. So if you're looking for letter word recognition, it would give you the exact tests that you could give to address that particular area. And this was really helpful, again, for staff who may not know, I really want to dig deep into this particular area. What test would I give? So we spent a lot of time working with our staff and saying, these are the tools, these are your resources, this is how to use this. So again, we could create comprehensive evaluations, because if we have very comprehensive evaluations, we're able to then take those to our IEP meetings, or in Connecticut, they're called PPT meetings, and really look at what that eligibility is at both the initial and at students' triennial evaluation. One of the other questions is, to what extent are pre-referral evidence-based strategies implemented consistently? And part of the mandatory 15% set aside had to go to some of the pre-referral, which, when you think about our disproportionality as being an intellectual disability, our students who are ID, they will be eligible for special ed, usually at a younger age, and it's not usually a MTSS kind of issue, but what we were required to look at that. And so we looked at what were our resources already in place, which were literacy and math interventionists at the schools. The schools had good processes for reviewing students who were struggling. But one of the things that we didn't have a consistent process in was looking at the MTSS process being consistent across the schools, and having staff know what, again, resources were available, what types of things we could share with parents, or if this school had this material, did another school have that? And so we worked for about 2 years in developing an MTSS manual with supports, and I'll show that on the next slide, to really be able to help students. Another piece was with the MTSS was we had a speech and language pathologist really be part of that initial piece, and use that the set aside to help support her having time to be able to go to schools, see some of the students who were struggling, and being able to provide some of those interventions to help our other SLPs know what those interventions are. And then we also have SEL and PBIS programs implemented at all of our schools, and we have district staff to be able to support that. So again, I think out of all of those, the two biggest things that impacted the most were the creation of our MTSS manual. So this is what our handbook looks like. It's a live guide, and we're still constantly updating it. So we went from meeting like every week to get this done within committees, to now this is a live document, but that we update it as we find things that we need to do. So for example, we're just in the last 2 weeks, we updated, I don't think it's been added yet, but we needed some kind of guidance of how you move from MTSS to that special education eligibility meeting, because people were very unsure of their roles, because you would have your literacy interventionist, your general education teacher, your special education teacher. Everybody's like, who's doing what? What's my piece? So we set out kind of like a defining roles of what that looks like. But we were able to, trying to scroll down and show, but we were able to put in some roles and responsibilities, and then looking at our forms and keeping those uniform. And then identifying what are different strategies. So here's reading intervention strategies at a tier 1 level. And so we created it so that you can actually click around and you don't have to like scroll, which is very nice. But we spent a lot of time doing that, so that again, using and looking at how can we, put processes in place. Because as I said before, one of the big things about looking at disproportionality and looking and monitoring your data is that you want to make sure you don't get out of disproportionality jail, for one thing, and end up back in it. So, we really took a look at what were all those different areas that we needed to support. We also, as I said before, have our SEL and PBIS are implemented across the district. We use Second Step for our pre-K through 8th grade, and Second Step just came out with a new high school program. I'm not trying to sell Second Step. We just happen to use Second Step. And I think it's good. It works well with our curriculum. But we actually have, as part of my behavior team, we have 5 members of our behavior team, and 2 of those are specifically identified to help with all of the proactive PBIS SEL, because we want to make sure that we're not waiting until the behaviors happen and then we're always being reactive. We want to be proactive and helping teaching those pro-social behaviors. So we have our 2, they're both doctorate level psychologists. One's also a BCBA. And actually they're married and they sit right next to each other, and they do an excellent job of, you know, getting out to all of the schools and making sure they help our teachers know how to teach the SEL lessons. Often they'll go in and do a mindfulness lesson or do an SEL lesson and give our staff a little bit of a breather while they do that. And really, you know, working with our students in, you know, what are the school norms? How do you address your own learning? Also, our one of the 2 is also a certified PBIS trainer. So we are a PBIS district. So we do ongoing training and support with our staff in looking at how to provide those positive pro-social behaviors, how to do interventions within the school. And so I think that that's a really important part when we look at what are those proactive early intervening skills that we were able to do across the district. So the 4th question was, has the district made any changes to its policies, procedures, and practices as a result of the disproportionality findings? In addition to all of the different trainings that, you know, we did, one of the, we participated in a statewide multidisciplinary team to look at disproportionality, and that included, so our gifted program is called ALP here in Greenwich. But we had our advanced learning coordinator, our ELA coordinator, our English learner coordinator, as well as our special education staff take a really wide look at that disproportionality, because we're also looking at our disproportionate of not being referred as an advanced learner for special education. So we've been working on that on the other side. So while this is specifically about the disproportionality for eligibility, we're actually looking at the disproportionality of our students and having access to the advanced learning in elementary, as well as the AP and honors classes at the secondary level. That's something that we've been tackling this year. But again, when you're looking at system-wide changes, you want to make sure you're addressing all of the different areas. For eligibility specific, I would say 2 of the biggest impacts that we had is, 1, we created a culturally and linguistically diverse evaluation team. So we reallocated staff so that we have a bilingual psychologist, a bilingual speech and language pathologist. We do have a monolingual education evaluator, because when we do the academic testing, that is given in English, but trained in working with culturally and linguistically diverse students. So they are, when they go in and they're able to, you know, work with our students who they are able to test bilingually in Spanish, but for the other languages, they're really able to look at that linguistically diverse population and help make that determination of whether it's a language issue or a learning issue, because we want to make sure, especially because our disproportionality is when we look with our Hispanic students, which a lot of them are English learners, and another area that we struggle with is that speech and language piece, which again was with our Hispanic population. So we wanted to make sure that we have the right people doing the evaluations and determining eligibility. And so they do initial and 3-year evaluations. And then they also work with school teams to determine if the student requires a CLD evaluation. And they do that working on, we updated our developmental history, social history form. So there was a form that just got emailed to parents when they made a referral to special ed and said, please fill this out. And it was sometimes filled out, it was sometimes not filled out. It didn't have a language section in it. So we revamped the whole social developmental history form, but also in which the process is completed. So instead of just emailing at home, we now have the social worker call. It's through an interview format. And we do that prior to holding the first PPT. So our first meeting is to determine whether or not we're going to go forward with testing and what those tests might be. So we do all of this before that first meeting so that we have information on a student's language background prior to walking into that meeting to have that conversation. So this is what our updated form, let me get bigger. Our updated form, and we have a specific area for our language and cultural information, where we're looking at what a student's primary language is, what parents' language might be, what the percentage of time they're speaking either language, asking their parents about how they would describe their child's language understanding, so that we have a really good picture of how the student is, what their language is before we walk in to determine testing. Because again, we want to make sure that if we're saying a student has a disability, it's not because of a language issue, that it really is because they have a disability. So we're now doing all of that on the front end, as opposed to previously it was after the team decided to move to testing, they would send the form out, and some kids, some students had the option, had the opportunity to have the CLD team, and others didn't, because there wasn't a systematic way of determining that. So after putting all those things in place, which is a lot, because we did that all in about in a year, in less than a year, is that we were able to move out of the disproportionality. So it was very nice to now get the letter that says, you're not disproportionate anymore, and you can actually go back in and fix your grant, and you don't have to set that aside, but to know that we really made a difference for all of our students. And so this is the following year, our disproportionality data, and we were able to, so this is where the disproportionality for our intellectual disability Hispanic was, where we were in the 4s, and now we did not even have a statistically significant discrepancy anymore. The other parts is that we were able to actually decrease our relative risk index for our students with autism who were labeled as Asians, our LD for Black and African American, and for our Hispanic Latino under the category of speech and language. So by doing all of that, not only were we able to get out of the disproportionality jail for our identified area, but we were actually able to lower that risk ratio for 3 other categories as well. And one of the ones, the speech and language one, is always one that I'm really watching, because it really is hard to look at that as a language difference or a learning difference. And I think, again, having the consistency of, we're lucky in that we do have a consistent, we have the forms from the state, but I think even if you're in a state that doesn't have those forms, having a consistent understanding across all of your staff members in determining eligibility is really important, and using that same process across all of your schools to make sure that those eligibilities, because when we started, it wasn't about identifying the wrong kids who were ID, it was that we really weren't using the eligibilities consistently. And so we weren't identifying as many kids who might qualify as ID. And, it impacts students later on in terms of adult services if you don't have that eligibility. So, there is something to be said about getting the eligibility to help families be able to access resources, and to really look at having that consistency across the district. So, I'm really proud of the work that our staff did, because, they're the ones that are at all those meetings and at the trainings and listening to us talk over and over again about making sure we have all of this in the evaluations. And they really did step up, and, put these things into practice. And, and I'm so proud that we were able to turn that around within a really short period of time between one cycle and the next, and lower it district wide across the district and the other areas. So thank you. And I don't know if anybody has any questions, because I can't see the chat and and this as well.
Thank you, Stacey. And I know that there were things in the chat that we do want to bring up, but I do want to say that at the end, everybody did say in the chat, congratulations, because this is a lot of work that you all put into the district for a full year to create that consistency, and speaks to that whole conversation that we all know that we need to do is for consistency of practice, but it's sometimes so hard to implement that we end up with seeing different practices happening in all of our schools in our district. So thank you for that work and congratulations. Lauren, do you want to ask some of the questions that came up?
Sure. I will ask one question, and then Nicole, if you're comfortable, I'll ask you to ask your question or describe. But one question, this is not a conceptual question. A lot of people asked if they could get the materials that you're sharing, if you were allowed to share them out of the district. So
yes, I should be able to share. It's a Google PowerPoint slide, so I should be able to put that in the chat to share that out.
Really great materials. Nicole, you want to share what you were talking about earlier?
Oh, so earlier in LAUSD, our policy is we don't use IQ tests for anyone. Doesn't matter your ethnicity. It's just across the board.
Mhm.
So I was looking at your list of assessments because we have something similar in our area. We call it psychological services. So there's a list of tests. General, you have your general battery, but it's a really robust list where you can say, well, this kid's got attention difficulty, so let me pull this. Or I'm really seeing some difficulties in the area of memory. So then there's some tests that you can choose from to kind of tease out things as well. But definitely for Larry P., it hasn't changed, even though there was an update to the California Association of School Psychologists. We got some information, but as far as LAUSD is concerned, we don't use it. Only GATE, if we're doing an assessment for GATE, then you might get it. But other than that, we don't use them.
Yeah,
So we use an alternative.
When I worked in California, because I was there for about 20 years before coming out here, and not being able to use a cognitive test, especially for students who were identified as African American, and depending on which district it was, whether it went out or crossed. But I think, again, it's the consistency of what are you using to make those decisions. So, you might not have the IQ, but are we using adaptive measures? Are we using the same measures, from this school to this school? Because, every school has different resources, no matter how much you try to, level it. And if I have this over here and this is how I'm making my decision, and the team over here is making this, you can't compare. And then that's where you then get to the student moves to a different school and they're like, what are you doing over there? And, trying to stop that with the consistency.
I would agree. We
Add
have,
sorry, go ahead, Nicole.
I would just agree that I was looking at your checklist. We also have those for the different eligibilities. For us, if you're going to consider emotional disturbance, you have to go to a case review. So you have to sit with other school psychologists and a specialist, and you have to present your case. So we have checks and balances in place, but sometimes things don't work out as well as we'd like. But I do like the idea, because we do have that consistency across. It doesn't matter if you're in the north in the valley or if you're in the south in San Pedro, we all have the same tests. It doesn't change. So I agree. It does help.
And L. Smith asks, no cognitive measures in California at all. No, it's because of the bias in IQ tests for African Americans in particular, it's not allowed to be used to make a decision of eligibility. And just as an FYI, for at least 30 years that I know of, there's been a push to stop using the IQ test altogether because it is clearly biased. It always has been. It was developed that way. So yeah, using all of these other measures and like Stacey said, consistency, but how you use these tests. But there's a push to get rid of the IQ test, period. And there's also
I think one of the things with Connecticut that I appreciate, because you have to use the IQ test and how we're doing it, is that they look at the adaptive measures at home and at school. And it's not just an IQ test and how you're performing at school. You're looking at that home piece as well. And often we see students who have so many more skills at home that they're demonstrating than just the academic skills. And they don't qualify as a student who has an intellectual disability because of that, which I think is good in that we're saying that, you know, it's not just the academic, we're looking at that whole picture of the child. But yeah, I mean, the IQ test and using that for determination does become very, very sketchy. But, you know, here that is part of the requirement that we have to have and we have to document.
Brooke, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. I am curious specifically about the speech and language strategies that you're using for prevention and in your MTSS work. I was stalking your website and the MTSS handbook, but I didn't see that. Are those, but I thought I saw you show it on your screen.
Yeah, so we have two documents. We have our staff document, and then we have an outward facing one that it's a little bit more limited because we're trying not to overwhelm with like anybody who goes on like as a parent, like here's all these things and a parent thinking, oh my goodness, I have to do all that. So we're working on trying to to kind of create a mid-level there. But the way that we have our MTSS set up specifically for speech is that tier 1 is in the classroom, and that we've given strategies like when you have a student who you might say is having difficulty following directions or things like that, you know, strategies that they could follow. Our tier 2 is where our speech and language pathologists consult specifically with the teacher and going into the classroom and observing. And then our tier 3 is where we would pull the student in question into an already existing speech and language group to then give them that intervention services within the speech and language, because should they qualify, that's what they would be in a group. So you're looking at can they pick up that skill in that short amount of time, but also being able to give them a more direct instruction to really help them with that. And then if they do qualify, easily transition them into the group.
Stephanie asked a question earlier, and Stephanie, because of time, I'm going to try to say what you said and see if I'm right. Stephanie asked, how do you get people to not just use the test they've always used, even with those options? And I'm going to, weave in the second question that was actually to Nicole about how do they think about assessments for ED and LA Unified? So Stacey, the question around how do you get people to use other assessments, and Nicole, if you're interested to share the ED stuff, that would be great.
It is a work in progress with using the more tests. And that's why I think we created the one document. We've also done a lot of professional development in terms of saying, okay, this is the kind of test you need when you're looking at this. you know, a Wyatt is, it's a great surface test, but if you're really looking at dyslexia, you need to be doing a CTOP, you should be doing a GORT, like you need to be digging deeper. The state of Connecticut, when we switched to our new IEP system, actually allows you to list what tests are actually given. So it doesn't just say academic, it lists. And so we're using that as the springboard to really have that discussion at our IEP meetings and to say, this is the information we need. These are the tests that have to be used so that when things happen, even because we plan our 3-year evals a year in advance. So even when you have a new team or somebody else is doing the evaluations, everybody's using those tests. And then we're also looking at, if you're doing a 3-year, you should be looking at what was done at the test before, because we want to be able to compare. So I might not have used that other test, but now that it's been done the first time, I'm going to need to do it in order to look at that progress. So it's definitely a work in progress, but we're trying to, again, set systems up that help to encourage staff to use those variety of evaluation tools.
And I just looked at the time and I think I have to turn it over to Ruchika to close out. And if anybody can stay after, and Nicole, if you want to talk about that after, if you have time, but I think we need to get people out of here on time. So thank you for your questions. Ruchika, you're muted.
I was just thanking everyone. Thank you, Lauren, for facilitating the questions. And thank you, everyone, for asking the questions, because it's only through this kind of conversation that we can build our own practices. So we thank you all for your time. And we are hoping that you're leaving here with some next steps. I think Stacey did post the slides in the chat. We'll do that one more time, just in case you didn't get it, so that you can grab them. But we also will be, like Catherine said, sending a follow-up email with the YouTube, and we'll add the link to the slide so you have that. As we will be also posting this recording once it's done in our urbancollaborative.org website, where you can also find some additional webinars, the things that we talked about earlier this morning, not this morning, just an hour ago, will also be posted in the urbancollaborative.org website. We want to thank Stacey again from Greenwich Public Schools and all of you for joining. Thank you, and see you in August. In the meantime, if you want to stay, please stay on. We are here for another 15 minutes if you would like to have another some of your questions answered or just continue this conversation.